When the dead come home, the true legend of the vampires. We like to think of monsters as fictions. We watch movies about elegant counts in velvet cloaks, and we feel safe because we know the vampire is just a costume. But in the mud-slicked villages of rural Slavic Europe, the monster they feared didn't wear a tuxedo. It didn't look like Dracula. They called it the Upiór. And the stories of the Upiór weren't Gothic romances. They were visceral, cruel, and terrifyingly real. To the people of old, these weren't campfire stories. They were a death sentence. Today, we're surviving the apocalypse in SurrounDead. But while I fend off these hordes, I want to talk about the grim pre-scientific truths that actually birthed the world's most terrifying vampire. The Upiór wasn't a stranger in the dark. It was a parent, a spouse, a neighbor, returning to the dinner table to drain the life from the family it once loved. And while the legends sound like supernatural horror, they are actually a haunting autopsy of a pre-scientific world grappling with cholera, tuberculosis, and the terrifying realities of human decomposition. From the breath of death that emptied whole towns to the horrific bloating truth of what happens to a body in the clay, we're exploring the dark history behind the myth. So, lock your doors, keep your shotgun close, and let's dive into the history of the Upiór. When you think of a vampire, you probably picture something elegant. A wealthy count in a velvet cloak, a clean theatrical bite on the neck, a peaceful sleep in a coffin of native soil. But centuries ago, in the isolated, mud-slicked villages of rural Slavic Europe, the creature they feared didn't wear a tuxedo. It didn't look like Dracula. They called it the Upiór, Upiór. And traditional Upiór stories aren't Gothic romances. They are visceral, chaotic, and relentlessly cruel. But what's even more terrifying than the legends themselves is the realization that these monsters weren't just campfire stories. To the people of old Europe, they were a terrifying everyday reality. Today, we're diving into the historical records of the Upiór and uncovering the grim pre-scientific truths that birthed the world's most terrifying vampire. The most psychologically horrifying trait of the Upiór was its hyperfixation on its own bloodline. It didn't hunt strangers in dark alleys. It came for the people it loved most in life. Imagine sitting at your dinner table with your family, grieving the recent death of a parent or a spouse. Suddenly, there's a knock at the window. The door creaks open, and in walks your deceased loved one. According to historical accounts, they wouldn't always attack immediately. The Upiór would sit down at the table, stare at you with dead, unblinking eyes, and act as if it were still alive. But the illusion didn't last. One by one, the creature would systematically choke, strangle, or drain the blood of its spouse, its children, and its parents. In historical records from regions like Trembola, a hungrier Upiór would slaughter everyone in the household, except for one single infant left crying in its cradle. Why? The folklore states the Upiór intentionally spared the child so it could grow up, have children of its own, and breed a fresh generation of blood for the monster to feed on decades later. But behind this horrific psychological nightmare lies a tragic medical reality. Long before germ theory, rural Slavic villagers had no idea how bacteria or viruses spread. What they were actually witnessing was the devastating spread of highly contagious, localized diseases, specifically tuberculosis and cholera. When tuberculosis, then known as consumption, entered a home, it would naturally wipe out a single household first, passing from one family member to the next. Because tuberculosis causes its victims to slowly waste away, grow incredibly pale, and literally cough up blood. Terrified villagers assumed that the first person in the family to die was returning from the grave to drain the life force of the survivors. The Upiór wasn't hunting its family. A deadly disease was. In modern movies, vampires sleep peacefully. But Slavic folklore describes the Upiór's obsession with blood as a literal physical addiction. When panicked villagers would finally pluck up the courage to dig up a suspected Upiór, they didn't find a pale, withered skeleton. They found a corpse floating, bathing, and marinating in a coffin completely filled with fresh, sloshing blood. The Upiór drank so much that its body became horribly bloated, its skin stretched taut and highly pressurized like an overinflated balloon. Historical texts warned that if a villager drove a wooden stake into the heart of an exhumed Upiór, the creature wouldn't just let out a dramatic groan. Because of the pressure, the corpse would literally detonate in a violent eruption of blood and tissue, completely drenching the executioners in a shower of gore. This sounds like pure horror cinema, but it is actually a perfect pre-scientific observation of natural human decomposition. When a body decays, intestinal bacteria produce massive amounts of gases like methane and hydrogen. If a body is buried in cold, heavy clay soil, this process slows down, causing the body to bloat massively and stretch the skin taut. Furthermore, internal pressure forces dark, liquefied tissue and blood out of the nose and mouth, making it look like the corpse has been drinking. When terrified villagers dug up a body during an epidemic, they lacked forensic knowledge. When they struck that gas-bloated body with a sharp wooden stake, they were essentially popping a highly pressurized balloon of decomposing fluids, and if the air trapped in the lungs escaped past the corpse's vocal cords during the impact, it made a horrific gasping or groaning sound, which the villagers mistook for the death rattle of a living monster. An Upiór didn't even need to touch you to kill you. Legends claim that an Upiór would sometimes climb to the very top of a village church bell tower. Once there, it would ring the bells or let out a piercing shriek that echoed across the valley. Anyone who heard the sound would instantly drop dead on the spot or fall into a sudden incurable illness. They were also believed to kill whole crowds just by breathing on them, casting a supernatural suffocating miasma over entire village squares. The truth behind this sonic execution and toxic breath lies in how ancient people understood the spread of plagues. For centuries, Europe operated under the miasma theory, the belief that deadly diseases were spread through noxious, foul-smelling air. When a massive outbreak of the plague or cholera hit a town, it felt sudden, invisible, and airborne. Lacking an explanation for how hundreds of people could fall ill simultaneously without ever touching one another, the folklore manifested this invisible airborne death as the literal breath or voice of the Upiór, echoing from the highest point in the village. Among all the violence, there's a deeply tragic and eerie side to this folklore: the return of deceased mothers. Women who died during or shortly after childbirth were considered prime candidates to become Upiórs, their sudden unresolved deaths tearing them away from their newborns. Legend says these tragic figures would rise from their graves at midnight, sneak back into their old homes, and forcefully cradle and nurse their orphaned babies. While it sounds protective, the folklore carries a grim twist. The undead mother's milk was toxic, and she would eventually consume the infant's life force. To prevent this, families in regions like Silesia would bury these mothers right against the outermost cemetery wall, physically distancing them as far from the town as possible. The truth behind this heartbreaking legend is rooted in the incredibly high infant mortality rates of the era. If a mother died during childbirth, the newborn was left without a reliable source of nutrition in an era long before infant formula. Grieving families would try to find a wet nurse, but in cramped, unhygienic conditions, contaminated milk or milk-borne illnesses frequently claimed the baby's life shortly after the mother's passing. Because the baby died so soon after its mother, the community's grief and superstition led them to a supernatural conclusion. The mother's spirit had reached out from the cemetery to pull her child back to her chest, accidentally poisoning it with the milk of the grave. Now, you might think the Upiór only struck in pitch-black bedrooms or silent graveyards, but some historical accounts describe them as aggressive, malevolent tricksters that terrorized public spaces in broad daylight. One historical record describes an insane, filthy Upiór that sprinted directly into a packed local tavern. It openly assaulted the patrons, pulled people's beards, knocked dinner spoons out of peasants' hands, and greedily stuffed its face with all the food on the tables. When a local shopkeeper tried to stop it, the Upiór casually flicked the man on the nose, but with such supernatural bone-crushing strength that the man's skull shattered, and he dropped dead instantly on the tavern floor. This highlights one of the most unique aspects of Slavic folklore. You didn't have to be dead to be an Upiór. Slavic folklore firmly dictated that you could be born a living Upiór. People born with physical differences, like a unibrow, a double row of teeth, a severe limp, or even just left-handed people and social outcasts, were heavily suspected of possessing two souls. When an individual suffered an outbreak of severe mental illness, a burst of violent psychosis, or extreme public intoxication, the village didn't see a medical crisis. They saw the secondary monstrous soul taking control. If a violent confrontation broke out in a chaotic, crowded tavern and a man suffered a fatal aneurysm, a stroke, or severe head trauma from a sudden blow, the pre-scientific community didn't understand the internal medical failure. They attributed that sudden, shocking death to the supernatural strength of the living Upiór among them. So, where did this entire explosion of terror ultimately come from? It comes from a clash of cultures and religion. For centuries, the pagan Slavs cremated their dead. Because the body was turned to ash, they never had to witness the physical, graphic process of human decomposition. But when Christianity entered the region, it introduced mandatory body burials. Suddenly, for the first time, peasants were putting their loved ones into the dirt and, during times of plague, digging them back up. The shocking, grotesque sight of what happens to a human corpse under the soil, the bloating, the purging of blood, the gases, is ultimately what birthed the physical terror of the Upiór. Long before cinema turned vampires into romantic anti-heroes, the Upiór was a localized, visceral explanation for disease, sudden death, and the terrifying mystery of decay. It was a monster born from the desperation of human beings trying to make sense of a world that was killing them. Next time you watch a vampire movie, just remember the villagers of old Europe. They would have traded Dracula for an Upiór in a heartbeat. What do you think is the most terrifying trait or truth of the Upiór? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know in the comments, what game do you want me to play next that fits this dark, atmospheric vibe? Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more dark history, and sleep with your windows locked tonight. See you next time.